Hello everyone and welcome to episode 4 of All Your Basics. Today we're going to look at an aggro deck, which is short for aggressive. We're going to get up in the opponent's face and beat them to death before they can get off the ground. So the overall plan for an aggressive deck is to close the game out quickly. We need minions that will pressure the opponent rapidly on the board, so we want a low curve so that we can deploy our threats quickly and efficiently. We want to be able to deal damage out of hand so that we can do more damage than is on the board at the start of our turn. So we want things like rush minions, we want pump spells, we want Primer's Fist, and we want a little bit of card draw to ensure that we can keep going into the mid game. We don't want to get to the late game, we want the opponent to be dead by then so that we don't have to deal with all their 6-drop, 7-drop bombs. That's the theory anyway. So one of the better factions for aggressive decks in Duelyst is Magmar. Vaath, the Immortal, is really quite good at smashing large amounts of face thanks to his Bloodborne spell. So Vaath's Bloodborne spell gives him a permanent +1 attack, which stacks with itself. So over time he gets to hit harder and harder and harder. And a lot of Magmar decks use Vaath as their finisher. We are not necessarily planning on going that far. We want to use him to deal consistent damage in the mid game, when he's hitting 3 or 4 a turn, which adds up really quickly. And we want to supplement that with obviously our minions, removal spells to keep Vaath alive while he does this, and a bit of rush to smash the opponent in the face out of nowhere and end the game abruptly. So every aggressive deck needs certain kinds of card. We need things that can come out of hand and deal damage to the opponent rapidly, ideally with not much need for a minion on board, or any need at all. So things like rush minions are perfect for this. So one card that's really good for this is Grid of Fortitude. It does need a minion, obviously, although it is very good with rush minions, and it's only 1 mana. It can be very good in the early game, where we play Grid of Fortitude on a 2-3, eat the opponent's 2-3, and we still have a 4-3 left over. That only costs us 1 mana. Or we can use it to push face damage, obviously. We get in a bit of extra damage this turn, make our minion larger and more threatening, possibly force removal on it, all for the low price of 1 tiny mana. So we'll want 3 of these. Next up is Primer's Fist. So you'll have seen Primer's Fist before. It's been in quite a few of these videos. And Primer's Fist is quite a good value minion, where you can play a 2-3 that allows your 2-3 to trade with their 2-3, or eat their 2-3 entirely and survive to absorb a general hit. Primer's Fist is quite good at just ensuring you stay ahead on board early on. But it's also very good at just helping you smash the opponent in the face for an extra 2 damage. Plus it's a cheap minion and we need a bunch of those, as we'll see as we go on. So let's put in some Primer's Fists. Next up is aggro staple Blazehound. So the Blazehound sees a lot of play in decks that can make more use out of the card than the opponent can, and or that want the 4-3 aggressive body. So ideally we're hoping to close the game out before the opponent gets to use their large hand, because it's probably going to be bigger than ours anyway. We're going to be attacking them in the face a lot in order to deal damage, which means our minions will eventually die. So we're not looking to make a large sticky board presence for a long time. So we don't really care about drawing them a card as much. But drawing us a card is very valuable because we're going to have to attrition through our minions and spend our cards aggressively to deal damage. So something like Blazehound, which has full power, obviously it deals damage really well, it trades up to maintain tempo by trading with minions larger than itself, all the while maintaining some sort of card flow for us. Means this card is awesome in our deck. I mentioned rush minions earlier. We obviously have Saberspine, which I constantly misspell because I'm British. So Saberspine is the archetypical rush minion. It's often a removal spell. We are hoping to use it to go face, often carrying a greater fortitude. But even by itself, 3 damage to the face when we've been hitting them with Vaath for several turns is often enough to do it. So we'll want the full 3 of these. Next up is a card that on the outset looks like it's a good value card, but I actually really love as just a way of smashing people in the face. I first came across this idea by repeatedly losing to it on the ladder. People would just equip adamantite claws and attack me with it, rather than trying to use it to get card advantage by eating multiple of my minions at the cost of only one card. Adamantite claws makes Vaath hit for at least 6, usually 7, and later on it's even more. If Vaath hits the opponent 3 times for 6 or 7 damage, that's around 20 damage. You know, that's most of their life. That plus, you know, them having attacked one of our 2/3s very early on to kill it, and a Saber-Spine Tiger hit is game by itself. Obviously, between other minions being able to shoot off the artifact, cards like Bloodtear Alchemist and Rustcrawler were unlikely to get that full value, and the opponent will often do everything in their power to run away and put things between Vaath and themselves. But, at least in theory, Adamantite Claws can essentially kill an opponent by itself. And certainly it's powerful enough that we want to play 3 of them, because even if we just get in for 1 hit of 6 or 7 damage and then the opponent removes the claws, we've still forced them to spend their turn removing it. You know, and if they have to crash minions into Vaath to do that, those minions are probably going to die. So it puts us very far ahead and can pressure the opponent very heavily. It's a very scary card. Next up we have Elucidator. I have no idea why this card is called Elucidator, like flavor-wise, because elucidate means something like to yield information, or to like get details, if I recall correctly, but I don't care, it's cool. So this card is a bit risky, so we're only going to be playing 2 of these, because I've actually tested this deck a bit more than the others, trying to get a build that I was happy with, and I found that Elucidators really clog up your hand if you draw multiples of them against decks like Songhai, where the 4 damage to your face is a real drawback. So Elucidator is really good at just, again, getting pressure on the opponent, making sure they are taking damage. The downside obviously is that you take damage as well, but we don't necessarily care about that. Note that Elucidator will trigger your Adamantite Claws and will remove a charge. So be careful about playing Elucidator when you have claws equipped. And if you need to use the Elucidator, make sure to attack with your claws first that turn. But we are going to put in 2 of these just because, you know, attacking the opponent for 5 and then leaving a 5/2 behind that they have to deal with, either with a spell, you know, that spend a card to do it, or by worse, hitting it with their own face. It's just really powerful. And very swingy. I lost a game. I was playing Abyssian against a Magmar player the other day, and they just played 3 Elucidators, and that was 15 damage. They were on 6 by the end of the game, and I would have killed them next turn, but it didn't matter. They just got me. And finally, for our aggressive Magmar cards, we have a Silhouette Tracer. So this is an unusual looking choice. Because the card itself is relatively defensive. You know, you look at it, it's like, oh, I can run my general away, or I can use it to snipe a minion for value. What we're mostly going to use Silhouette Tracer for in this deck is to catch up. So if the opponent plays a provoked minion next to Vaath, or puts lots of minions in between Vaath and the opponent, and we're trying to get lethal with claws or with Vaath's buffed up body, it can take a long time to get around that. You need to draw a bunch of removal, you need to make sure you're, you know, trying to put yourself in a position where you can remove a minion, then move past it, which is quite difficult with Magmar's particular suite of removal spells. Whereas Silhouette Tracer just lets you just nip around the side. You know, I'll just teleport away from your Ironcliff Guardian and hit you in the back. Perfect stuff. So we'll want 1 of these. I've seen other lists play more than 1. I think I'm just going to put 1 in this list, but feel free, if you end up using it a lot when it comes up, feel free to add another one, because I think the card is actually quite powerful. In a pinch it can also let you run away, but generally this deck wants to be on top of the opponent and pressure them. So if they're pressuring you, we don't really have very many tools to deal with that. So we've got a bunch of sort of sensible looking obvious aggro staples. You know, these are all cards that can help us maintain momentum, deal a bunch of damage to the opponent, even get a little bit of card advantage sometimes. But obviously this isn't a deck by itself. We need a mana curve, especially if we're going to curve out early and bash the opponent in the face from the word go. So we need to flash out with creatures. We need minions. So we want to add a bunch of cheap minions. One of the most obvious choices is Blood Tier Alchemist. This guy is, again, you know, we've seen him before in a few of these videos. Blood Tier Alchemist is a pretty powerful card. The ping is handy. The amount of tempo it gains is pretty significant because it's only 1 mana and you can remove an entire minion with it. And the fact that it dies to a general hit in this deck is not a big deal. The main issue is it dying to things like Ghost Lightning and the new Blistering Scorn. But generally, if it survives a turn, we can just run it into something for 2 damage. If the opponent hits it with their face, that's fine. You know, maybe it killed something and then dealt them 2 damage. That's exactly the sort of card we want. So it's pretty good in this deck. Young Silithar is one of the better 2-drops in the game. It's not quite as good as the insane Lionar ones. Windblade Adept, which is the 4/3, as long as it's next to your general, or Azeroth Lion, the one with celerity. So it's not the best thing ever, but your opponents always have to respect the rebirth. They have to do something about the egg. Normally they can, but they have to. It slows them down a bit, which can be great for us as an aggressive deck. We want to get in there and keep the opponent a little bit off balance. So if they're forced to mess around dealing with eggs, that's great. 3 copies, please. And then for the other 2-drop, I actually have tried a bunch of different options in building this deck. I've experimented with it a lot more than the other decks I've built because, again, I was trying to find something I was happy with. And I've tried Flameblood Warlock in this slot, which is the 3/1 for 2 that deals 3 damage to each player. That was okay, but the fact that it was really bad against Songhai, and again the newly printed Blistering Scorn. I also tried Shiro, the 1/4 puppy dragon. I love Shiro, but it was very awkward in this deck for reasons I'll get into later. So in the end, the other 2-drop I want to play is Rust Crawler. This might seem like an odd choice because it's essentially a tech card, but the effect is relatively valuable. If we're going to be hitting the opponent in the face, the last thing we want to do is take insane amounts of damage doing so. And they can also remove things like Blood Rage Mask, which is not only, you know, useful for Songhai and racing us, but can deal with our own Adamantite Claws by pinging Vaath repeatedly. So with Rustcrawler we can get rid of stuff like the Blood Rage Mask or the dreaded Arclight Regalia, which is really hard for an aggro deck to grind through. And considering the low cost of that, you know, it's probably better than Healing Mystic. So we're going to put a couple of those in. Finally, I wanted another 4-drop, just to have something to plop down and secure the board. And I went for some Veteran Silithars. This card is by no means mandatory in this deck. If you have a 4-drop that you prefer, these are good cuts. You know, you can cut them for the 3rd Elucidator if you're in a fairly slow meta. You could cut them for cut one for another Silhouette Tracer if you want one of those. Primus Shieldmaster is quite a good one, just because the provoke means it can hold opponents in place. Veteran Silithar has some small advantages over its competitors. It doesn't die to Plasma Storm. It is big enough to deal quickly with things like Shiro, and what else is toughness 4 and valuable? Not that much really. Stuff like Spelljammer, I guess, although you generally want to leave Spelljammers alive. But mostly it's the fact that it has Rebirth. You know, again, it's just something annoying that the opponent has to take into account and deal with. And its already sizable body carries things like Greater Fortitude very well. You know, Veteran Silithar with Greater Fortitude on it eats a 3/6 and lives to tell the tale and then some. So we'll want a couple of those. Okay, so next we want to add some removal, interaction. So even though, in theory, an aggressive deck wants to ignore everything the opponent does, we're not playing a deck or a faction that is quite capable of doing that. Generally, Magmar decks rely on keeping the opponent off balance and just sort of pounding them hard and making it very difficult to play around certain cards. Because we're building kind of budget decks here, obviously I want this to be relatively accessible to players with small collections, new players, then we're sort of a bit left out of some of the most powerful Magmar cards for that. Things like Earth Sister Taygete and Macantor Warbeast come to mind. And I've also elected to go without the sort of janky but gross, like actually good plan of flash reincarnation into massive 7-drops, which is really fun, but also not very budget friendly. So we're gonna stick with a low curve, but we do need to have some amount of interaction with the opponent. Even if you were playing the version that had all these, the Earth Sister and the Macantors and stuff, those cards are so powerful because they inevitably deal damage to the opponent and also trade for some of their cards. So the opponent has to sink resources into dealing with these threats while also taking damage the whole time, and that just leaves them extremely vulnerable to getting hit for 3 every turn by Vaath. So we're going to try and do the same sort of thing with somewhat cheaper removal spells. But the advantage of that is you can start off with something like the deck I'm going to show you and gradually add in the Macantors or the Taygetes or Flash Reincarnation into stuff like Sunsteel Defender or Ixun or Pandora as you get the cards, as and when. So we don't have Macantor Warbeast. If you don't know what Macantor is, I should probably explain. Macantor Warbeast is an archetypical Magmar card. Whenever you're playing against Magmar, they always have them. They always have 2 of them, and it's really annoying. This card essentially deals 4 damage in a space around it and leaves a damaged body behind. Normally a 4/2 because it'll attack the general and kill whatever's standing next to the general. So obviously it can destroy a minion, sometimes 2 minions, deal 4 damage to the general as well, and then force them to clear it up, either with another card or with their face. Which means that they're under a lot of pressure in terms of either card advantage or damage or both. It's an epic, so it's a little hard to get hold of. I was lucky in that I opened 3 of them quite early on. And they are worth crafting if you want to play Magmar. But just to be aware that this combination of effects, Rush and Frenzy, is very powerful. We can do the same sort of thing with our existing Rush minions and the card Diatide Frenzy. So you do sometimes see this played alongside Macantors and things in fully kitted out Magmar decks as well. And it's a lot more powerful than it looks. It's also, I hear, very good in Gauntlet. I do remember losing a couple of games to Diatide Frenzies in Gauntlet in my first couple of runs, but that was when it was 1 mana. I don't play that much Gauntlet, so I haven't run into it since. But this card is just, again, it's a bit awkward. You have to have either a Rush minion or a minion that survived on the board. But then all of a sudden you just get to deal a whole bunch of damage in an area of effect for only 2 mana. And normally your minion will be able to attack something that won't kill it on the counter attack and survive. And then your opponent has to deal with that. So it's a somewhat situational effect, and it doesn't increase the minion's toughness. But we can use this to really blow holes in the opponent's defense at an opportune moment. So let's put in 2 copies. Natural Selection. This is a staple Magmar card. It's a bit awkward, but sort of more powerful than it looks. This card is the reason I didn't like Shiro. I mean, Shiro also forces you to kind of clump up your positioning anyway, whereas I generally want to be spreading my minions around the opponent and just pushing, and not be held back by having to make a little ball around Shiro. But primarily the reason was I had a game where my opening hand had something like, it was Shiro, natural selection, no other 2-drops, and it was against a Songhai player. And I realized I made my replace decisions, looked at the hand, I was like, yeah, this is fine. Wait, no, this is not fine. Because the natural selection doesn't kill Lantern Fox anymore. Lantern Fox is a 2/4 that gets the opponent free spells every time they deal damage. Every time it takes damage. So removing it with natural selection is really valuable. This deck is quite vulnerable to stuff like Lantern Fox. So being able to remove them easily is very powerful. Natural selection is also great when your opponent has the only minion on the board. You know, if there's nothing else on the board, but they have an Ironcliff Guardian or even like a 7-drop, you know, you can just natural selection it away. Bam. Which can really blow people out when they're trying to protect themselves by putting stuff in between Vaath and their general, or by playing provokes. When there's not much else on the board, you can often pop their defender with natural selection and get in for more damage. So we want 2 of those. We don't want the full 3 because it is situational. You know, if we have an egg on board, it's bad. If you're playing against Songhai and they've used Onyx Bear Seal to turn one of your minions into a 0/2, natural selection doesn't do anything, and so on. Next up, I've mentioned this card a couple of times already, Blistering Scorn. So this card came out today. It is, don't be fooled by the stat line, it's a 3/3, because it deals 1 damage to itself. This thing is basically a circular Blood Tier Alchemist. It hits everything. It's a bit awkward, given that we're playing a lot of small minions, and we have our own artifacts. The reason I'm including this is mostly to see what it does. I've had one game with it so far, where it almost certainly won me the game on turn 2, by allowing me to clear both my opponent's minions and have a 3/3 left up. I attacked my 2/3 into one of my opponent's 2/3s, hit the other one with my general, and played the Scorn. Boom. So it's also very good against, it can clear up ranged tokens from River without being as small as Blood Tier Alchemist. You know, in terms of board impact, like when you're slightly behind and just trying to get a foothold. And it's very good against Swarm Abyssian, which is a bit of a nightmare matchup for a deck like this. It's really good at killing 1/1s and sort of unlocking your natural selection as well. So it has a little bit of utility, probably enough to justify the slight anti-synergy it has with our deck. You know, the nice thing about Duelyst is that if you can play cards that don't combine well in the same deck to a reasonable extent, because often if the rest of your deck is well oiled enough, you have some luxury of just replacing the cards that don't work with the stuff you've drawn. So I think playing some Blistering Scorns is quite a good idea, because I think the games where it just massively puts us ahead or saves us will outweigh the games where it gets stuck in the hand or we have to do something awkward with it. Next up, Repulsor Beast. So I like this card, and I don't think it doesn't see as much play as it used to, I think, but it's just quite a powerful effect when all you're looking to do often is just get minions out the way and get in on their face. Because we can close out games quite quickly, we really don't mind if the enemy unit is going to be back in position in a couple of turns, because often they might be dead by then or nearly dead. So the Repulsor Beast is a reasonably powerful effect for us. It's kind of clunky enough that I only want 1, but that's in large part because of the next card on this list, which is just sort of generally superior to it, Eggmorph. We're going to want the full 3 Eggmorphs. So this card is a little expensive. It's clunky. You know, it doesn't... Eggmorphing something and killing it doesn't feel anywhere near as good as natural selectioning it. But the effect is useful enough, kind of mandatory enough to some extent, that we want it. It's really good against Lionar, because it lets us deal with their provokes very easily. It's really good against large minions from Abyssian. It's good at removing something like a 4 Winds Mega or a Shadow Dancer for 1 turn, just to turn off of its effect. The mode where it hatches your own egg, I think very rarely comes up, but generally this card is just really good hard removal. The only real downside with it is that it save the opponent some damage because we have to hit the egg instead. Unless it's on the very last turn of the game where you can egg something and then walk past it and attack. But yeah, the card is powerful enough, you know, it's hard removal with a built-in silence, that we want the full 3. So we've got 2 slots left, and the deck is looking, you know, pretty solid at this point. But there's one thing I want to put in, which is I want to put in a couple of essentially Hail Mary cards. So in Magmar are a bit odd. Sometimes you just roll the opponent. You know, you have all these cards that deal loads of damage to their face and kill their stuff at the same time. You've got powerful rebirth minions that are difficult to attrition through. You've got some of the best buff spells and some of the most efficient and punishing removal spells. And so sometimes you just steamroll people. But when Magmar decks don't work, they don't work. You know, they really... There's a clunkiness there, and we're sort of exacerbating that slightly by being on the budget end of the spectrum, because Magmar's 2 best generalist cards are fairly high rarity. I'm talking again Macanta Warbeast, which is the Rush Frenzy thing, and Earth Sister Taigete, who is the one of the 7 sisters. Whenever she takes damage, she deals that much damage to all nearby enemies. This card basically demands something like an Egg Morph, or will deal huge amounts of damage to the opponent's board and or their general. But owning this card requires owning 3 copies of all 6 Magmar rares. Pretty unreasonable at this point. So because of this, our deck has weaknesses. I mean, this is known, right? Budget decks. For me, the key to building good budget decks is finding game plans that don't require the high rarity cards. Not because those high rarity cards are somehow miraculously bad, but because the game plan can be filled up and made satisfying. You know, you can find 39 cards that fit really well with just cheap stuff. So things like, we saw the Lionar Golem deck in episode 2. That deck could eschew all of the expensive Lionar cards because all it needed was these massive golems and some cheap stuff to support them. The Arcanist Vitruvian deck we looked at last week, there were, I mean, in theory you could add Imara healers, for instance, these very powerful Vitruvian legendary 6-drop, but you'd have to find something to cut for them, and that would weaken the engine. With Magmar, I found it very difficult to put together a budget deck that isn't sacrificing anything. Which is also partly why I've spent so much time testing this. It's quite difficult to make a Magmar budget. Same with Abyssian. For the record, Abyssian and Magmar, I feel, are the 2 hardest factions to make budget versions of. So to combat that, the deck is like a little bit of a mishmash. You'll notice we have things like Blistering Scorn in the same deck as this Toughness 1 creature, Blood Tear Alchemist. We have... Oh, and Adamantite Claws, obviously. We have our own artifacts as well. You know, you can, again, because the cards are all in your hand, you can choose to avoid the anti-synergy, but, you know, you have to. And that's unfortunate. But the reason we have all this stuff is so that in our deck, there are answers to certain situations. There are situations on a board where Blistering Scorn just, pow, you win. There are situations on a board where Blood Tear Alchemist is just really nice. So Adamantite Claws deals them 12 damage. So to that end, we're going to include a couple of cards that really don't look like they belong in here. And both of these cards see a fair amount of play in general Magmar decks anyway. They're not bad cards, in fact they're quite good. But they look out of place. But I will explain exactly why and what we're covering up with them. So the first one, we're going to put in an Earth Sphere. So again, this card looks really strange. Why do we need a pure health gain spell in an aggressive deck? We shouldn't care about our own life total, we only care about the opponent's. The problem is that Vaath really has to put himself in harm's way in order to do his work. And you'll see Earth Sphere is played in a lot of Magmar decks. Ours is a bit faster, than the typical. You know, we're playing Elucidators, we're playing a very low curve, we don't have anything more than 4 mana. But we still need to be able to outlast the opponent sometimes. We still need to just make sure we can get in for those extra couple of hits. Especially against decks like Songhai, who have a lot of damage and will just race us. So in those situations, Earthsphere can really swing the game by just giving us that little bit of extra longevity that we need to, you know, grind through, get in their face, and deal the last few points of damage. So we're going to put in 1 Earthsphere. The other one, when I mentioned that we don't have anything more than 4 mana, I slightly lied. The other one is Plasma Storm. So this card kills almost everything in our own deck. That is true. We can sort of avoid that with Greater Fortitude and to a lesser extent Primus Fist, but you know, generally this card is not one we'd want to play against either. Although again, note that we have control over when we play it and when we replace it. The reason Plasma Storm is in here is because there are some board states where if you could just kill all their stuff, you would still be able to win. Right? Like, you know, you've got a Vaath with an artifact on, and the opponent's on lowish health, but they've just got loads of stuff. You know, they've got a Lantern Fox, and they've got a couple of small minions, and a ranged minion, and they're gonna overwhelm you next turn. Plasma Storm deals with that. It also deals with Blood Moon Priestess, which is a card that Magmar typically really struggles with, because none of their removal kills it, except Plasma Storm, which not only kills the Blood Moon Priestess, but kills all of the things it spawned as well. And so, with Plasma Storm, what you generally do is the opponent kills all your minions and snowballs their own board state, and you play Plasma Storm and just reset. And it's enough to potentially get you back in your feet. They can play minions again, but Plasma Storm gives you enough time to get Vaath next to them, deal some slightly more damage, hopefully also play a cheap minion to follow up. And you know, it's just there to haul us out of a few really tough situations and deal with a couple of cards that come out very early in the game that we're going to struggle with, like the Blood Moon Priestess. It's also great against Lionar because it kills Ironcliff Guardians, especially Ziran, the heal general, because she can't make them 5/10s like Argian can with his +2 power Bloodborne spell. So, going to put in 1 Plasma Storm, and again, it's just there as an out when we really just need to clear off whatever they're doing. Tip, it also is very good against Pandora. Pandora is a 3/10 that spawns 3/3s with abilities. It's a 7-drop legendary creature. It's very good. It's sort of a common finisher. It's like I think it's commonly regarded as the best neutral legendary 7-drop game ender minion. So Plasma Storm is one of the few ways of neatly dealing with it, even if it's been around for a couple of turns. And so that's something to watch out for as well. So, looks like we're done. We have one aggressive deck. We've got a fairly low curve. You know, we've only got 1 card above 4 mana. We've got a good number of 2 mana plays to get us out early. We've actually got a decent number of 3 mana plays by Duelyst standards, a whole 9 3-drops. It's quite rare. We have some efficient removal to let us maintain tempo, keep the opponent on the back foot, and continue smashing them in the face with Vaath the Immortal. And we have things like Elucidator, Saberspine Tiger, and Adamantite Claws to really lay down the hurt and ensure the opponent is going to be dead before they can stabilize and bring out their big guns to crush us. So that's the hope. As usual, I'm going to stop recording here and split the games into a different video for everybody's convenience. I hope this was interesting, and I'll see you after the jump.